Okay. Yeah, sí, vamos. Well,
Yes.
good evening to everybody, and welcome to this sort of virtual diplomatic school. It is a privilege, really a privilege for our school to host Professor Robert Service today. He's, maybe you know, but he's one of the leading historians of his generation, and his contributions to Russian and Soviet history are as outstanding as they are influential. Professor Service studied Russian and ancient Greek at Cambridge University prior to his graduate studies at the universities of Essex and St. Petersburg. He's currently teaching at the University of Oxford. He's the author, among other seminal works, of a history of modern Russia, as well as biographies of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, which, by the way, are available in Spanish as well. And well, now I don't want to be long because I mean we are wishing to hear Professor Service, but I am proud to give Professor Service the floor for his much anticipated presentation on the history of Ukraine from the October Revolution to the present. I hope the audience enjoys it thoroughly. Thank you very much, Professor. We are going to listen carefully to you.
Well, thank you very much for that thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I suppose this would not be happening quite so readily were it not for the terrible events that are happening in the east of Europe, in Ukraine at the moment. And it's important to get a mental focus on why this war broke out in February 2024. And it's quite impossible to understand the outbreak without going back several decades into Russian and Ukrainian history. Russia, according to Vladimir Putin, is a very special place, a special place that is hardly distinguishable from Russia itself. He speaks of a brotherhood between Russia and Ukraine. He thinks of Ukraine as an artificial phenomenon with no right to an independent existence. He is also aware that the agricultural and industrial assets of Ukraine would certainly strengthen the Russian economy itself. And he thinks in terms of the longue durée of the Russo-Ukrainian relationship, stretching back to Kievan Rus, where Russian orthodoxy, Russian Christian orthodoxy itself was born, so that there is a romantic menace in Putin's ideology concerning the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And I want to focus particularly on the 20th century and thereafter. But it is important to bear in mind that the history of the relationship predates the 20th century. And the crux of the crisis of the winter of 2021 into 2022 is to be seen in the ambition of independent Ukraine to join not only the European Union, which from the Russian point of view was bad enough, but also the wider NATO alliance, which has always been anathema in the mind of President Vladimir Putin. Now, why is this so? Why on earth is this so? Ukraine was always a very special place. It had enormous ethnic diversity before the First World War. The Ukrainian peasantry, the peasants of Ukraine, most of them spoke the Ukrainian language, but the towns teemed with Poles, with Jews, with Greeks, and with Russians, because Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. But on official maps published by the Tsarist authorities, there was no such place. So the idea that Ukraine didn't have a separate identity was deeply rooted in the Russian official consciousness before the First World War. And on official maps, what we now think of as the south of Ukraine was known as Nova Russia, New Russia, and the area around Kiev was known as Mala Russia, Little Russia. And that indicates that the Russians never wanted this whole region, this whole country, to be considered independent, and not even to be considered a country. And since Ukrainian peasants identified themselves mainly with their village, or particularly with their family, but after that with their village, and weren't especially national conscious, self-conscious, then the Russians got away with this. Ukraine, though, was always special because it was so rich in grain. It was the breadbasket for Central Europe before 1914, and it had a burgeoning metallurgical industry, which fed from the great mines of the Donbass. So that in the First World War, the Germans envied the Russian Empire for its Ukrainian assets. And when the Russian state fell apart in 1917, the Germans not only intended to force Russia out of the First World War, they also intended to occupy that special place, Ukraine. And they were instrumental in forcing Soviet Russia to recognize Ukrainian independence, while they themselves economically despoiled, exploited Ukraine as a way of sustaining the German war effort, which was faltering in the year 1918. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918, saw Ukraine for the first time acquire statehood. And after the collapse of German military power at the end of the First World War, Lenin took the decision, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Soviet state, took the decision that it would be unwise to re-establish purely Russian control over Ukraine, that it would be much more sensible to declare the existence of a Soviet Republic of Ukraine, which would be part of a federation whose center would be the Russian capital, while giving cultural and administrative autonomy to the Ukrainians and fostering the Ukrainian language, which had been severely repressed under the late Tsars. So that by this apparent relaxation of central Russian control over Ukraine, Lenin hoped to win over Ukrainian popular opinion. In the 1920s, this had the untoward result of encouraging encouraging Ukrainian national consciousness and national assertiveness, such that the old worries that the Tsars had had, the Russian Tsars had about Ukraine, were revived. And when Joseph Stalin, at the end of the 1920s, decided to introduce a drastic campaign of Sovietization, of collectivization of agriculture, and of bloody terror in order to inaugurate another revolution in the USSR, a second revolution that went even further than Lenin's first revolution. He also clamped down on national self-expression among the Armenians, the Georgians, the Azerbaijanis, but also and especially the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians had the potential to be the model Soviet republic if they were forced into a tighter framework of Soviet rule. And as part of the collectivization of agriculture, Ukraine was sealed off for a period from the rest of the USSR, and very, very violent methods were used to push the Ukrainian peasantry into collective farms and to pull out of those collective farms all the surplus grain that was available. When the harvest failed to produce the amount of grain that had been expected, then nevertheless the quotas were insisted on. And the result of that was the death of at least 2 to 3 million Ukrainian peasants. It was a man-made famine. So Ukraine suffered at least as badly as any other republic. Probably the only other republic that suffered as badly was Kazakhstan in these years, in the 1930s. So Ukraine had been punished, and as a result of that punishment, Ukrainian national resentment festered, and that festering of resentment led to a greater growth of national self-consciousness among Ukrainians. And this explains why, when the forces of Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, initial reports showed that many Ukrainian peasants living a terrible existence on Soviet collective farms welcomed the German invasion. They quickly understood their mistake, but I'm just saying this to emphasize how awful the conditions were in the USSR for Ukraine at that period. Ukraine remained a troublesome area, a troublesome region, a troublesome republic, a troublesome potential country throughout the following decades. And after the Second World War, Stalin, followed by Khrushchev, followed by Brezhnev, made it their task always to stamp out nationalist opinion in Ukraine, an opinion that was widespread, especially in Western Ukraine. Now, there's a reason for this. The boundaries of the USSR were changed at the end of the Second World War at the expense of pre-war Poland. So Ukraine was pushed westwards in terms of its boundaries. Poland was pushed westwards at the expense of Germany. So Poland was shifted westwards, and so was Ukraine. And this meant that in Ukraine, there was suddenly incorporated millions of Ukrainian speakers who had experience of life outside the Soviet Union. And it's in Western Ukraine that the most bitter anti-Sovietism resided after the war, and partisan warfare was prolonged into the 1950s and was savage and on both sides, and was savagely suppressed by the Soviet army. The lesson was delivered to Ukrainians. You may want independence, some of you may want independence, but your only hope of a better existence is to reconcile yourself to permanent membership of the Soviet multinational state. A degree of relaxation was allowed for Ukrainian culture, for Ukrainian folk song, but Ukrainian history in the textbooks was always portrayed in terms of the friendship of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples and the benefits that great Russia had brought to Ukraine, particularly in the Soviet years. While all this was going on, however, a Ukraine that had once been the breadbasket of Central Europe was a paltry image of agricultural progress in the Soviet collective farms that spread all over this agriculturally rich area. And Ukrainian metallurgy, while it was part of the backbone of the USSR's industrial efforts, was never as efficient as it could have been had it been run on the lines of the market economy. So that steadily groups of dissenters pressed for Ukrainian rights. The KGB very easily and systematically arrested them. Emigre groups sought to link up with sympathetic Ukrainian dissenters, but these efforts also were broken up very, very effectively. So Ukrainian independence was never realized. Ukrainian autonomy was never fully achieved either, because there was always a suspicion that if the controls were lifted, then Ukrainian self-assertiveness would be resumed, just as it had done in 1918 when the Germans were treating Ukraine as a puppet state. So that there were many republics which that succession of rulers from the late Stalin through to Khrushchev through to Brezhnev, there were many worries throughout that period that of all the republics, Ukraine could be the most problematic. It was, after Russia, one of the biggest republics in the USSR, taken by itself, and excluding Russia, it was the biggest landmass on the European mainland. Although it was so severely contained within the USSR, it had its own seat at Stalin's request in the United Nations from its foundation. So it was very obvious that this was a republic that could be a problem. And when reform came to the USSR in the late 1980s, under the general secretaryship, the party general secretaryship of Mikhail Gorbachev, there was a notable reluctance on the part of the reformist group in Moscow, who were parceling out political, economic, and cultural reforms to the whole of the USSR. There was a notable reluctance on the part of the reformist group led by Gorbachev to completely let go of the reins in Ukraine. It was recognized that if Russia was a Slavic heartland, then the second heartland of Slavdom was Ukraine. It was a sensitive area, and therefore the so-called popular movements, the Narodные fronty, that emerged in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were formed in advance of what happened in Ukraine. Ukrainian self-assertion was slower in being organized, partly because the controls remained tighter in Kiev than they were in Tallinn or Vilnius or elsewhere. But when they did start getting loosened in 1990 through to 1991, then it was very, very difficult for Moscow to hold on to the process. Part of the reason for this was that the Ukrainians had suffered so much at the hands of Moscow rulers, from Alexander III and Nicholas II in the late 19th century and early 20th century, from the requisition squads that Lenin sent into the countryside in the civil wars that covered Ukraine in 1919 and 1920 and 1921, but above all by the depredations that Stalin undertook from the end of the 1920s throughout the 1930s and across the 1940s, from the middle of the Second World War onwards and through to his death in 1953. So there were these decades in which Ukrainian national opinion was being stoked with resentment. Now we need to add to that the conditions in which Ukrainians were living in the late 1980s, because the reform of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was accompanied by economic collapse, which resulted in the massive fall in the standard of living across the USSR, not just in Ukraine. But Ukrainians felt that they had no longer any reason to associate themselves with Moscow and its rule. Gorbachev gave priority to winning consent from the various peoples of the USSR. He deluded himself into thinking that his reforms would bring about a very enthusiastic sympathy for his purposes among the peoples of the USSR, instead of which opinion turned in favor of snatching from Moscow even more reforms, even more concessions. And in 1991, Ukrainian national opinion turned more and more towards the objective of seeking a referendum with a singular question: should the Soviet Ukraine be allowed to hold a plebiscite with a view towards realizing national independence? And the communist leadership of Leonid Kravchuk, who died just as recently as last month, moved increasingly towards the view that if the communists were going to hold on to Ukraine, then they had to distance themselves from central communist rule in Moscow. And so steadily, Kravchuk, who was not yet the president of Ukraine, but was the dominant ruler, moved towards a position of demanding independence for fellow Ukrainians. A plebiscite was held after the August 1991 coup, and it took place at the beginning of December 1991, and the result was an overwhelming vote for secession. at which point Boris Yeltsin, who was president of Russia, but not of the USSR, came to the conclusion that the continued existence, even of a reformed USSR, was untenable. And the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly after the Ukrainian referendum and declared jointly the end of the USSR, a decision that they presented to Gorbachev in Moscow by telephone, at which point Gorbachev saw that the political game was up for the USSR and he resigned his post and accepted the end of the Soviet decades and the termination of the USSR. Now, the Ukraine, from the beginning of 1992, went into its experiment with independent nationhood within an independent state. The second time that Ukraine had state independence. And for most of the 1990s, Ukraine privatized, marketized, generally reformed its economic regulatory framework in the same sort of way that Russia did. Russia went into a vast economic depression, but so too did Ukraine. And when Russians lamented their conditions, their cost of living, their incapacity to restore the domestic economic well-being of their country, they could at least look across to Ukraine and say to themselves, and they did say to themselves in their newspapers and on TV and in all of the media, well, at least we're not living in Ukraine. Conditions here might be bad, but conditions there are even worse. What they overlooked was that corrupt and oppressive as the political system was in Ukraine, as it was in Russia, it was not as static as it was in Russia. And elections meant something, even in the 1990s in Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine's economy was reduced to a shambles. Ukrainian politics was chaotic, oppressive for the general Ukrainian population, but it was much more volatile than the Russian political system was in the 1990s. And so there were glimmerings of a future in which the Ukrainian electorate could take decisions which would embarrass the incumbent president of Ukraine or the incumbent parliament of Ukraine. And so it came to be in our current century that Ukrainians step forward at elections and decided that they would get rid of some of the assumptions of their politicians in the 1990s. They would overturn the tie of the link, the almost exclusive link with post-communist Russia, and would look more to the European Union and seek ties with America also. And at the election of 2004, which was chaotic, extremely chaotic, involved all sorts of accusations of false counting and false recounting, a victory was achieved by a reformer who promised to cement ties with the European Union and with NATO. And this obviously enraged Russia, enraged Vladimir Putin, who had been the president of Russia since the year 2000. Ukraine had played a very careful role in not annoying Russia in the 1990s. When the Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994, Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear weaponry on condition that Russia respected the Ukrainian boundaries, the Ukrainian frontiers, and Ukrainian territorial integrity and security. Over the years, Russian bullying produced a reform movement that came to power in 2005 and looked for a different orientation in Ukrainian affairs. It didn't last for long. At the elections of the year 2010, the reformers were booted out. They had not eradicated economic corruption. They had not improved to any great extent the standard of living of enough Ukrainians. And they themselves were riddled with shady deals behind the scenes. They discredited themselves as Democrats. But the democratic wish of Ukrainians to disengage from the close Russian embrace returned in 2013 when the pro-Russian president Yanukovych went just a step too far in his pro-Russian diplomatic dealings. And there was a surge of Ukrainian popular opposition on the Maidan in central Kiev, a surge of opposition to Yanukovych, who was forced to flee. And where did he flee? Naturally, he fled to Russia. And a reform agenda was established in 2014, privileging the Ukrainian language, giving every incentive for the development of purely Ukrainian interests, and moving towards, again, a rapprochement with the European Union and, if possible, with NATO. And at that point, Putin decided that enough was enough, that bargaining with the Ukrainians was getting him nowhere. He had warned that any talk of Ukrainian NATO membership would have severe consequences because Ukraine, after all, was an artificial state, he said, and he would not allow it to become what he thought would be a puppet state of America. And he invaded the Ukrainian peninsula and occupied it and incorporated it into the Russian Federation. So since that point in 2014, Ukraine has been at war with Russia. The war with Russia did not start in February this year. And Russian enclaves declared their independence of the Kiev authorities from that point onwards. And negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, mediated by some of the European powers, failed to secure an end to the fighting. In these circumstances, the Ukrainians went further in their national self-assertion, and they embodied in their constitution the ambition to acquire NATO membership. And this meant that Ukraine was now more hotly opposed to Russia than it had been at any time in its history since 1918. And this was a very, very dangerous period, a period of warfare in the eastern Ukraine, with no permanent victory either for the Russians or for the Ukrainians, that went on through 2015, 2016, 2017, through into 2021. And I think that the year 2021 is a cardinal point for our analysis of why war broke out in 2022. In June 2021, the new young president, Volodymyr Zelensky, announced that he would actively seek NATO membership. He'd said this before. He had come to power as a reformer. He had been comparatively measured in what he said about Russia. He had promised to put an end to economic corruption in Ukraine and to turn Ukraine into a model democracy. He hadn't done this. He hadn't achieved this objective. In fact, his popularity sank across the months of 2021, so that by the end of the year, he was achieving only a popularity rating of 30%. But part of his effort in 2021 to regain the popularity that had brought him to power in the first place 2 years earlier, part of his effort was concentrated on proving himself a national hero and showing that he would seriously accept the offer of the new president in America, Joe Biden, to include Ukraine in the broader NATO membership, just as had been done with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the entire former East European bloc. In the following month, in July 2021, Vladimir Putin published a lengthy essay about Ukraine, about its lack of right to be considered separate in its history or in its contemporary reality from Russia, and indicating implicitly but very clearly that the path that Zelensky had chosen for Ukraine would end in disaster. At the end of the year, in December 2021, President Biden repeated what he had said in June 1921 and signed a preparatory strategic partnership with Ukraine, so that on the NATO side of the negotiations, there had never been a closer relationship, at least in future military terms, than was obtained by the end of 2021. The tragedy of all of this is that nationhood is stronger in Ukraine by the end of 2021. A feeling that a country has the right to choose whatever path it wants, economically, politically, and strategically, and that Ukraine is ready to take a path of independence involving an embrace of the European Union and NATO. The tragedy of this development, as we look in retrospect, but I must say I did feel it at the time, was that no preparatory steps were taken by those in the West who made the offers to Zelensky and the Kiev administration. No preparatory steps were made to allow the Ukrainians, or even encourage the Ukrainians, to take the precautions necessary to withstand a potential Russian invasion. In my mind, what happened in 2021 then was an amateurish Western engagement with the Ukrainian question. The Ukrainians played a part in this. They have paid the most terrible cost for this. There is no excuse for what Putin has done. There was, however, every reason to expect a drastic military reaction from Moscow. The one that has happened is a savage indication of all of this. So Ukraine's history doesn't come out of nowhere. It's very, very important to see the Russian-Ukrainian relationship in terms of the big, wide picture of years of oppression, bullying, and the concomitant resentment felt by Ukrainians, and through their travails, the emergence of an ever more assertive and self-confident Ukrainian nationhood. And we do not know what will come of this, because we are unable at the current time to predict the outcome of this appalling and inexcusable war that Putin calls his special military operation. So I'll finish on that gloomy note. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your outstanding lecture. If you're agreeable, we could start a little Q&A, for about 15 minutes. That's that we have, if you have it. I don't see any questions in the chat, so let me come up with one of my own.
Yeah.
While people ponder their own. And it's this, and it actually is a chain of questions. You alluded to the Bolshevik Revolution, and got me thinking the ensuing civil war in the Soviet Union. Did it contain sort of somewhat of a war of independence in Ukraine as well? And secondly, given the way Stalin and others suppressed that revolt in the early 1920s, could the Golodomor, the genocidal famine of the early 30s, could it have been a carry-on of that repression, the early 20s, in the midst of the Soviet Civil War? And finally, and referring as well to the line to the Golodomor, it surely can be explained away with economic management or mismanagement in this case of the leaders. But was there a specific intent, genocide, without the basis of a social class, that being the kulaks? Or could it have been a genocide on the basis and of eliminating national action? Which one of them would it
be? These are very interesting questions. In the civil war that followed the October Revolution, the Ukrainians who were in favor of independence were defeated in 1919, but they went on fighting. They went on fighting into 1920, and the Red Army defeated them. They wanted their statehood. They defended their statehood against Soviet rule, and they were defeated. But they didn't go down to defeat quietly. So you're right that through the civil war, Ukrainians, or some Ukrainians, were willing to fight for the retention of statehood. The Soviets, when they came into Ukraine in 1919, they sought to Sovietize Ukraine. In fact, some of the first attempts to set up collective farms, which peasants everywhere hated, took place in Ukraine. And the peasants rose up in revolt all over Ukraine in 1920. So they didn't rise up in armies, in organized armies. They rose up in defense of their village or their group of villages. The Soviets picked on certain groups in Ukraine for very vengeful treatment, as you said. In the early 1920s, they particularly moved against the Cossacks of Ukraine and southern Russia. And in fact, they had a policy of de-Cossacization. So the idea of solving an ethnic problem or a national problem by means of ethnic cleansing didn't start with Stalin. The group around Lenin were already practicing that in the early 1920s. But they did it on a less systematic basis than Stalin was to practice in the 1930s. In regard to the question of genocide, then one thing is absolutely clear: there is no disagreement at all about the fact that Stalin intended to completely devastate the old Ukrainian way of life. And to that extent, he was destroying Ukrainian nationhood. And under some definitions, this was genocide. This was already genocide. Even if you exclude from the analysis the fact that he killed by starvation between 2 and 3 million Ukrainians, so that there's no doubt that Ukraine suffered a terrible, terrible and deliberate campaign of suppression and physical elimination. But his ultimate intention was also to turn Soviet Ukraine into a model Soviet republic with a view to the rich agricultural land and the prosperous manufacturing base of Ukraine becoming a beacon to Eastern Europe, showing the benefits of communism. In other words, he wanted a Ukraine that would be a communist Ukraine and therefore different from what most Ukrainians wanted for Ukraine. Now, you can say that this was itself a form of genocide because the Ukrainians didn't espouse it. But ultimately, Stalin's purposes would have been thwarted if the Soviet Ukraine that he wanted didn't come into existence. So ultimately, he wanted a prosperous Ukraine, but he sought to achieve this by the most devilish and murderous methods that were contrary to the wishes of the Ukrainian people. It's a complex set of purposes that Stalin had, and none of them were regarded as good by the Ukrainians themselves. That's an interesting question you asked there. Ukrainians look back on this with utter hatred of, and rightly look on it with utter hatred for what was done to them.
Thank you, Professor. I see a question that is a lengthy one, so I'm gonna try and sum it up real quick for you. The questionnaire refers to the breakup of the Soviet Union and wonders if, in hindsight, the breakup was bound to happen no matter what, or whether the understanding that you refer to between the three major republics in the West trick that otherwise maybe wouldn't have happened.
Well, these are really big questions. These are big questions, and I'm grateful for that one too. In the long term, there was no serious prospect of the Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian peoples remaining reconciled to inclusion in the USSR. They got their chance to assert themselves because of reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev introduced in his period of rule between 1985 and 1991. But the seeds of national self-assertion were already there. They were seeds, though, that the KGB and sometimes the Soviet army sought to exterminate. But it would have been hard to keep the Baltic states in the USSR against their will at a time when the old controls had been loosened. So the Baltic republics, the Soviet republics of the Baltic region, gained their chance to do what they would eventually want to do anyway. And as the Soviet economy collapsed, the ability of Moscow's rulers to say to the peoples of the Baltic republics that actually their life was not at all bad, and in fact it was better than the life lived by most Russians in the Russian Republic, that sort of rhetoric ceased to have traction. In Ukraine, 30% of the population was Russian speaking with Russian as a first language. Intermarriage between Ukrainians and Russians was a widespread phenomenon. Ukrainians lived in Russia and Russians came to live in Ukraine. Some of the great Russian writers of the 19th century, such as Nikolai Gogol, were born in Ukraine. Some of the dominant rulers of the USSR, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, were either born in Ukraine or lived and worked for a long time in Ukraine. So there's no doubt about it that there was a strong liaison between the Soviet republics of Russia and Ukraine. The breakage of the link between the two Slavic peoples was going to be messier and more difficult than it ever would be between, say, the Russians and the Estonians, the Russians and the Latvians, the Russians and the Lithuanians. But I think that so long as the USSR failed to create a prosperous economy, and moreover, failed to prevent knowledge of Western economic success from penetrating the USSR, once the quarantine of information that was laid down under Stalin started to be eroded, then Ukraine was always going to be a problem for Moscow. But it would have taken many, many more years had it not been for the reforms of political and social and cultural relaxation that were introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev. So I tend to think that I do think that the USSR was doomed by virtue of its economic incapacities, as well as the histories of national oppression. It would have taken more years. It just so happens that the spark for the explosion was lit in the years 1985 to 1991.
Thank you so much, Professor. We're coming on the end of our lecture here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you for the benefit of the public and my own benefit, since I'm a big admirer of yours. Are you working on a book or any particular work that you'd like to?
At the moment?
Present moment, yes.
Oh yeah, yes I am. Yeah, I am. I did a book which came out in paperback in 2020 on Putin, on the period from 2012 onwards through to 2020. And I'm thinking of updating that to include the Ukraine war, but more specifically, I've nearly finished a new book on a conspectual account of the Russian Revolution of 1917, starting in 1914. I think the Great War has been overlooked as part of the Russian Revolution, and going up to the death of Lenin. I've nearly finished it, and when I've done that, I'll go on to Putin.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very inspiring presentation in the lecture, and also for this last tip. I think many of us we looking forward to read your new book and to look for in libraries this biography on Putin from 2012 to nowadays. I'm sure we will find interpretations for this conflict and for the near future that we are still waiting for to know what happened. Thank you very much. The history is a good lesson for the interpretation of the present, and you have contributed for all of us in this sense. We appreciate very much your being with us.
Thank you very much. You're very kind, and it's been a delight for me, and I've enjoyed meeting all of you.
Thank you, and all the best for you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, Baro, and everybody. Bye.
Bye.